My name is Victoria Ashford, and I'm 41 years old now, sitting in my penthouse overlooking the skyline of a city that once felt like my enemy. But when I close my eyes, I can still feel the cold tile floor of that studio apartment where I spent the darkest 3 years of my life. I can still smell the dampness in the walls, still hear the sound of my own heartbreak echoing in rooms barely bigger than closets. My story is one I never thought I'd have to tell, and honestly, I'm not sure where to start. Most people would say to start at the beginning, but my beginning doesn't feel like the real beginning at all. The real beginning was the day I buried my husband, the day they made it clear that I had no place in the world he came from, and the day I learned that everything I thought I understood about my marriage was incomplete. What happened next changed everything, and I had no idea that my real inheritance was waiting for me all along, hidden in places I never thought to look, growing while I was lost in the darkness, waiting for the moment when I would finally be ready to claim what was always meant to be mine. Let me start from where the pain began, not at the start of my story, but at the point where my old life ended and my real one started, even though I didn't know it yet. My husband's name was James Ashford. He was 52 when he died from a sudden aneurysm, a man I'd met 14 years earlier and had spent every day since trying to deserve. James came from old money, the kind of wealth that doesn't advertise itself through designer logos or flashy cars. His family owned commercial real estate across 3 states, had investment portfolios that most people couldn't even comprehend, and maintained a social standing that had been built over generations. He was kind to me, genuinely kind, but there was always this invisible line between his world and mine. I was a teacher when we met, working at a public school, living in a modest apartment, saving every penny I could. James was at a charity fundraiser I'd been dragged to by a colleague, and somehow we ended up talking in the corner for hours. He was different from what I expected. Thoughtful, genuine, interested in what I had to say. He didn't make me feel like I was beneath him, which I learned later was rare in his circles. When he proposed 3 years into our relationship, I was the happiest I'd ever been. It felt like the universe was telling me that I deserved good things, that love could transcend these invisible class boundaries that seemed to separate people. We had a small wedding with just immediate family because James wanted it that way. His mother, Alina, was polite but distant. His father had passed years before, and his 2 older brothers, Charles and Richard, attended but said very little to me. There was something in the way they looked at me, a kind of assessment that made me uncomfortable, as if they were evaluating whether I was worth the Ashford name. My own family was thrilled. My mother cried at the altar, my father walked me down the aisle with pride, and my sister stayed by my side through the entire reception. But I could see James's family watching my family with mild disdain. They were kind enough, but there was a fundamental difference in how they moved through the world, how they spoke, what they expected from life. The first years of marriage were beautiful. James was generous with his affection and his resources. We traveled, we built a life together, and he encouraged me in my teaching career even though his brothers occasionally suggested I should simply be a homemaker. We didn't have children, though not for lack of wanting. After 3 years of trying, we learned that I had complications that made pregnancy nearly impossible. James told me it didn't matter, that he was happy with just me, but I always wondered if his family thought I was a disappointment, unable to give them an heir to the Ashford legacy. We moved into a beautiful house in an upscale neighborhood, a house that James owned before we married. Everything seemed perfect on the surface, but looking back now, I can see the cracks that were always there. James's family visited regularly but never quite treated our house like it was our home. They treated it like a property that happened to have James in it. His mother would suggest changes to the daycare. His brothers would talk business deals in the study as if I wasn't even there. And through it all, I told myself this was normal, that all wealthy families probably operated this way. The morning James died started like any other morning. He woke up earlier than usual for a conference call with the East Coast office. I made him coffee the way he liked it, with just a splash of cream. He kissed me goodbye and went to his study. 30 minutes later, I heard a crash. I ran in and found him on the floor, and in that moment my entire universe collapsed. The paramedics said it was massive, that he likely died almost instantly, that there was nothing anyone could have done. But standing in that study, covered in his blood, I couldn't believe that life could end so suddenly, so completely. They told me he was gone, and I remember feeling like I couldn't breathe, like the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. The next few days were a blur of funeral preparations, condolences, and a grief so profound I didn't know how I would survive it. The funeral was held at the Ashford family church, a stone building that had been in their life for over a century. Hundreds of people came, powerful people, important people, people who seemed to exist in a world I was just visiting. I sat in the front pew wearing black, my hands shaking as I tried to hold myself together. Eleanor sat next to me, her face a mask of composure, never letting a tear fall. Charles and Richard sat on her other side, whispering to each other occasionally, their expressions unreadable. I remember thinking that grief looked different on them, more controlled, more dignified somehow, or maybe they were just better at hiding it. After the funeral, people came back to the house. The Ashford house, though it would soon stop being my house, became a place for people to pay their respects and tell stories about James. I heard things I'd never known about my husband, stories from his childhood, tales of business triumphs, anecdotes about his intelligence and his character. I listened to these descriptions of a man I thought I knew and felt like I was grieving a stranger. 2 days after the funeral, I was sitting alone in the house trying to process the enormity of my loss when Eleanor called. Not to check on me, not to offer comfort, but to request that I meet with her and the boys at their lawyer's office. She didn't ask if I was available, she told me when to be there. My stomach twisted with a feeling I couldn't quite name, something between grief and fear. The lawyer's office was cold and formal, all dark wood and leather chairs that cost more than I made in a year. Eleanor sat at the head of the conference table like she owned it, which I later learned she partially did. Charles and Richard flanked her like bodyguards. I sat across from them, my hands folded in my lap to stop them from shaking. Mr. Pemberton, the family lawyer for 3 decades, opened a folder with the kind of ceremony you'd expect for something monumentally important. He began reading from James's will, speaking in that clipped, professional tone that lawyers use to deliver news that isn't going to be received well. Mr. Pemberton's voice washed over me as he detailed James's assets. The house where I lived would pass to the family trust. The investment accounts, the business holdings, the commercial real estate, all of it was structured in a way that meant Eleanor and the boys maintained control. James had been generous, or so I initially thought, leaving me with a settlement that at the time seemed substantial. $2 million, which I naively believed would sustain me for years. A car. A collection of jewelry that had been his mother's, and the expectation that I would be moving out of the house within 60 days. I sat there, stunned, as Mr. Pemberton explained the arrangements as if he were reading me a shopping list. When I found my voice, I asked if James had mentioned anything about his plans for me, if there was perhaps another document, something that explained the will or clarified his intentions. Eleanor laughed then, a sharp, cruel sound. "My dear," she said with a smile that looked like a knife, "James's intentions were quite clear. He provided for you far more generously than he had any obligation to do. That $2 million is more than most people see in a lifetime. We suggest you invest it wisely and build a life of your own." I left that office in a daze, and over the next month things got worse in ways I couldn't have anticipated. The house, which had been my home for the past 11 years, suddenly felt hostile. I couldn't help but notice how quickly the family moved to reclaim it. They hired contractors to begin renovations immediately, discussing plans as if I weren't living there. Eleanor came by one afternoon with a woman from an estate company to catalog the furniture and artwork, deciding what would be kept and what would be sold. She walked past me in the hallway without acknowledging my presence. I realized then that in the eyes of James's family I had already become irrelevant. I was the temporary wife, the outsider who had outlived her usefulness. I consulted with a lawyer of my own, a young woman named Patricia who was kind but clear. According to the will, I had no legal claim to anything beyond what James had explicitly left me. His will was airtight, drafted by excellent lawyers who had closed every loophole. The $2 million was mine to keep, but nothing else. I tried to talk to Eleanor, thinking that maybe as a woman, as another person who had loved James in her own way, she might have compassion. I was devastated and homeless within 2 months. Surely, I thought, she would understand. I went to their family house, a sprawling estate on the other side of town, and asked to speak with her privately. She received me in her sitting room, a space so formal it felt more like a museum than a place where actual people lived. Eleanor listened to my pleas with a detached politeness that was somehow worse than cruelty. "The settlement is generous," she told me, "more generous than fair if I'm being honest. James was a sentimental man, and I believe he felt some obligation to you despite your brief marriage. But the Ashford fortune is for the Ashfords. You're not family anymore, Victoria. I'll always be grateful to you for the years you shared with him, but it's time for you to move on with your life." She said it like she was doing me a favor, like she was being kind by dismissing me so cleanly. I moved out of the house on a cold November morning. I rented a truck, loaded my personal belongings, and drove away from the life I thought I would have forever. I had $2 million in a bank account, which should have been enough to start over comfortably, but I didn't know how to live alone after 14 years of marriage. I didn't know how to make decisions without checking in with someone else. I felt like I was moving through the world as a ghost, invisible and untethered. I found a studio apartment in a less expensive neighborhood, not because I couldn't afford better, but because I felt like I didn't deserve better. I told myself a story that I had failed, that somehow I should have known James wouldn't have provided for me more substantially, that my presence in his life had been transactional all along. Depression settled over me like a heavy fog that I couldn't shake. I stopped going to work. My principal called repeatedly, asking if I was okay, if I was coming back. I took a leave of absence first, then eventually, a year into my grief, I resigned. I couldn't face going back to teaching, couldn't face the questions about my husband, couldn't face the pity in people's eyes. The $2 million sat in my bank account and I couldn't bring myself to spend it. It felt dirty somehow, like blood money, like I was profiting from James's death. I spent my days alone in that studio apartment, barely eating, barely sleeping, existing in a liminal space between life and whatever comes after. My mother tried to reach out, but I pushed her away. My sister visited and I sent her home in tears. I couldn't face anyone's concern or their questions. I couldn't explain to people who hadn't lived this life what it felt like to be erased so completely, to go from being someone's wife to being nobody. A year into this darkness, I stopped leaving the apartment at all. I ordered groceries delivered. I paid my bills online. I existed in a space that was smaller than my sadness, which somehow felt appropriate. It was during this time, in the second year after James died, that I received an unexpected letter. It came to the lawyer's office address that was listed as my last known residence, and somehow it found its way to me. The envelope was old, cream-colored, expensive. My name was written in James's handwriting. Victoria, it said, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. I held that letter in my hands and my fingers trembled as I opened it. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind of stationery James had always preferred. His handwriting filled the page, but this wasn't the everyday writing I was familiar with. This was careful, considered, the penmanship of a man who knew he was writing something important. My love, the letter began, I'm writing this because I need to tell you something that I've been too much of a coward to say to your face. By the time you read this, I'll be gone, and I'm sorry that I've left you to discover this truth when I'm not here to explain it properly. The words seemed to jump off the page, each one feeling like it carried weight and meaning I couldn't yet understand. I kept reading, my heart pounding faster with every sentence. I've spent the last 5 years of our marriage watching my family dismiss you, watching them treat you as though you were less than, and every single time I let them. I was afraid, Victoria. Afraid of their judgment, afraid of what they'd say if I stood up to them, afraid of my own weakness. But I'm tired of being afraid, and I'm tired of being complicit in their cruelty. I want you to know that I love you completely and entirely, and that despite what my will may suggest, you were never meant to be discarded like some temporary convenience. I sat down on the edge of my bed and continued reading, tears streaming down my face. The rest of the letter explained something that changed everything about how I understood my marriage and my place in James's life. James had told me in this letter that he'd had a separate estate set up years before we even met. It was his own personal investment portfolio, kept entirely separate from the family trust and the business holdings that passed to Alina and his brothers. He'd never mentioned it to me while he was alive, which seemed strange, but as I read on, I understood why. He'd wanted it to be a surprise, something he was setting up specifically to protect me, but he'd been waiting for the right moment to tell me. He never got that moment. The letter contained instructions for how to find it, account numbers, the names of lawyers and financial advisors who would be able to help me access what was rightfully mine. James had left everything in this separate estate to me, not to his family, not to charity, to me. The letter explained that he'd spent years building this wealth independently, making investments in technology companies, real estate development projects, and hedge funds that his family didn't know about and couldn't control. He estimated that the account had grown to approximately $150 million by the time he wrote the letter, 5 years before his death. I must have read that number a dozen times, convinced I was misunderstanding, that perhaps I was in shock and my brain was misinterpreting the words on the page. $150 million. The letter went on to explain why he'd kept this from me and from his family. His family's money is old money, and with it comes old expectations. They believe that wealth is something to be protected and controlled, not something to be used or enjoyed or shared freely. They believe that money is power and power should be concentrated in a few hands. I never agreed with that philosophy. When my father left me his business, I ran it, but I also changed it. I reduced my own salary to increase what we paid our lowest-wage workers. I started a scholarship fund for underprivileged students. I tried to use my wealth to create change, but my family saw it as weakness, as irresponsible spending. They wanted me to be more ruthless, more willing to exploit every advantage, more comfortable with inequality. I couldn't do it, but neither could I stand up to them, not openly, not until now. So instead, I created this separate estate, this hidden wealth that allowed me to maintain peace with my family while still building something that reflected my true values. The letter continued with instructions about accessing the accounts, but it also contained something more important. A plea. If anything happens to me before I can tell you this in person, I need you to promise me that you'll use this money to do good in the world. Don't become like my family. Don't let wealth corrupt your heart or make you greedy or cruel. Use it to help people, build something meaningful. Live the life you've always wanted without compromise or fear. You're stronger than you know, Victoria, and you're better than anyone in my family deserves. I love you. I'm sorry I was too weak to say all of this to your face. I'm sorry I let them treat you poorly. If I could redo those moments, I would choose differently, but I can't. All I can do is leave this with you and hope it makes up for the years I failed you while I was alive. The letter was signed with his name, followed by a date that was from 2 months before he died. 2 months before his death, James had written this letter, addressed it to the lawyer's office with instructions that it be delivered only if he died before a certain date. I sat in that studio apartment in the darkness, holding a letter that had just turned my entire world upside down. My first instinct was to think I was being scammed, that this was too good to be true, that perhaps someone had forged this letter as some kind of cruel hoax. I called the number on the letterhead that James had written in his letter, a private bank in a city I'd never been to. The woman who answered the phone had a professional, measured tone that immediately made me believe this might actually be real. After I provided some identification information and answered security questions that only someone close to James would know, she confirmed that yes, there was an estate. Yes, James Ashford had set up the account decades ago, had been adding to it regularly, and had named me as the sole beneficiary. The account had grown significantly since his passing, she explained, because the investments continued to perform well. The current balance as of that morning was approximately $184 million. I had to sit down. I felt like I was going to faint. $184 million, that number meant nothing to me and meant everything at the same time. It was abstract, impossible, a number that didn't exist in the real world, surely. The bank representative explained the process for accessing the funds. I would need to provide additional documentation, meet with their legal team, and sign several agreements. There were tax implications to understand, investment advisors to consult with, and decisions to make about how to structure my access to this wealth. It would take a few weeks to complete all the paperwork, but once it was done, the money would be mine to use as I saw fit. I hung up the phone feeling like I was in a dream, like at any moment I would wake up and find myself back in the darkest part of my grief, with nothing but a $2 million settlement and a broken heart. But the dream didn't end. Over the following weeks, I worked with lawyers and financial advisors, moved money, set up accounts, and began to comprehend on some level what having this kind of wealth actually meant. It meant I could pay off any debt, fund any dream, help any person in need. It meant that the world that had felt so hostile and closed off to me was suddenly open. It meant that I had choices I'd never imagined possible. The first thing I did with my newfound wealth was leave that studio apartment. I found a beautiful house, not the kind of show-off mansion that James's family would have chosen, but something warm and elegant and full of light. I hired a therapist. I actually got therapy, something I desperately needed but could never afford before. Dr. Chen was a woman in her 60s who had a way of seeing through my pain to the person underneath. Over the course of several months, she helped me process my grief, my rage at James's family, my feelings of inadequacy and rejection. She helped me understand that the love James and I had shared was real, even if it had been complicated and imperfect. She helped me forgive him for his cowardice while I was alive, understanding that he'd been trapped by his family dynamics in ways he couldn't overcome on his own. She helped me realize that his death and his betrayal of Alina's expectations by leaving me this money was, in a way, the most honest and loving thing he'd ever done for me. I also reconnected with my family. I went to my mother's house and asked for her forgiveness for pushing her away. She held me while I cried and I told her everything. My father, a practical man who'd spent his life working with his hands, couldn't quite comprehend the numbers I was mentioning, but he understood that I was going to be okay. My sister came to the house and we spent the afternoon talking about everything we'd missed while I was lost in depression. She told me that she'd been worried I might hurt myself, that she'd considered calling someone to do a wellness check. I was grateful that she hadn't, that I'd found my way back on my own with James's letter as a guide. With the money secured and my mental health beginning to improve, I made a decision that I believed James would have supported. I decided to investigate what had happened to his estate and whether his family had known about this separate account. If they didn't know about it, fine. But if they did, if they'd known that James had money he wanted to leave me and had hidden it from me anyway, that would be a different matter entirely. I hired a private investigator named Marcus, a man with a calm demeanor and the kind of experience that came from 20 years of uncovering uncomfortable truths. I explained the situation and asked him to look into whether Eleanor, Charles, or Richard had any knowledge of James's separate estate. Marcus was thorough. Over the course of 3 months, he interviewed people, examined financial records with the help of lawyers, and dug into the Ashford family history with the kind of persistence that made me believe he was going to find something. And he did. What Marcus discovered was that the Ashford family had known about the existence of the separate account. Eleanor had mentioned it once in a conversation with her lawyer, which had been documented in files that Marcus was able to access through legal discovery. Moreover, there were emails between Charles and Richard discussing James's financial independence and their frustration that he refused to consolidate his wealth with the family holdings. James had told them at some point that the account existed and that it was his money to do with as he pleased. The family had assumed, based on what James's brother Charles had written in an email, that upon James's death the account would either pass to the family or would be split between them. When Eleanor and the lawyers discovered that I had been named the sole beneficiary, they'd made a decision that changed the course of everything. They'd kept it quiet. They'd let me leave the house, let me live in that studio apartment, let me believe that the $2 million was all I was getting, knowing all along that there was a separate account worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They'd kept James's letter from me, delayed its delivery, and generally hoped that I would simply accept my dismissal and disappear out of their lives. When I learned this, I felt a cold rage settle into my chest that I'd never experienced before. The grief transformed into something else, something sharper and more focused. My lawyer, Patricia, was the one who suggested that I had grounds for a lawsuit. The family had deliberately withheld information that was material to my understanding of my financial situation. They had, in essence, committed fraud by omission. More than that, there were questions about whether they had intentionally interfered with James's attempt to communicate his wishes to me through that letter. I thought about it carefully. I thought about what James would have wanted, about whether suing his family would honor his memory or betray it. But then I read the letter again, use it to help people he'd written, build something meaningful, and I realized that what I needed to do wasn't just about me anymore. It was about justice, about accountability, about making sure that the system that had allowed them to commit this kind of fraud couldn't be used on someone else. I told Patricia to proceed. The lawsuit I filed against Eleanor, Charles, and Richard Ashford was not about money. I had more money than I could spend in several lifetimes. It was about principle. It was about making them acknowledge what they'd done, about forcing them to face the consequences of their choices. The lawsuit alleged fraud, interference with inheritance, and unlawful withholding of information that was vital to my understanding of my deceased husband's wishes and intentions. The family fought back hard. They hired some of the most expensive lawyers in the country. They argued that I had received what I was legally entitled to under the will, that anything beyond that was a bonus I had no claim to, that the separate account was James's private matter, and they had no obligation to inform me of its existence. But then my lawyers found something in the discovery process. James had drafted a letter to his family telling them about his intentions regarding the account. He'd written it but never sent it, perhaps too afraid of their reaction, but it had been found in his office files. In the letter, James explained that he wanted his family to understand that when he died, I was to receive the full balance of the account without interference or delay. He had asked them to respect his wishes, to treat me with dignity and care, to help me understand what I was entitled to. The letter was devastating to the defense's case. It proved that James had explicitly intended for them to facilitate my access to these funds, and instead they had done the opposite. They had obstructed my access and allowed me to live in poverty while knowing that I was entitled to wealth. The judge in the case was a woman named Judge Morrison, someone with a keen sense of justice and a low tolerance for rich people playing games with the legal system. She ruled in my favor on all counts. More than that, she imposed sanctions against the Ashford family for what she called deliberate and malicious withholding of material information. She awarded me an additional $20 million in damages, specifically for the fraud and emotional distress they had caused. But the real victory came when Judge Morrison read aloud a statement from the bench about the conduct of the Ashford family. She spoke about how wealth often bred a sense of entitlement and a belief that rules didn't apply to people like them. She spoke about how the law existed to protect everyone equally and that money didn't get to circumvent justice. She spoke about me with compassion, acknowledging the years I'd spent living with the belief that I was worth less than what my husband had intended for me. She spoke about James's wishes and how his family had violated his memory by refusing to honor them. It was the most validating moment of my life, hearing a judge essentially tell the Ashford family that they had behaved badly and that there were consequences for their actions. The ruling made national news. The headlines called it the case of the widow versus the dynasty, the story of a woman who took on one of the country's most powerful families and won. The publicity was intense and uncomfortable, but it also meant that I couldn't be ignored or dismissed. I became, suddenly and unexpectedly, a public figure. The attention brought things into the light that the family had tried to keep hidden. Journalists began investigating the Ashford family business practices, the way they'd treated employees, the real estate deals that had made them wealthy. Reporters found people who'd been hurt by their business decisions, workers who'd lost everything when Ashford companies had eliminated pensions or closed locations. The narrative around the family shifted from one of respectable old money to one of calculated cruelty and financial exploitation. Eleanor and her sons denied everything, but the damage was done. Their social position, which had been their greatest treasure, was cracked and then shattered. Doors that had been open to them for generations began to close. Charitable boards asked them to step down. Country clubs quietly suggested they might want to reconsider their memberships. The wealth was still there, but it had lost its luster, and for people like Eleanor, reputation was worth more than money. The settlement from the lawsuit, combined with what James had already left me, meant that I was now sitting on a wealth that was almost incomprehensible. The numbers were so large they didn't register as real, but James's letter kept coming back to me in quiet moments. Use it to help people, build something meaningful. That instruction felt like a responsibility I couldn't ignore. I started by establishing a foundation bearing James's name. The James Ashford Foundation was designed to support exactly the kinds of causes that James had cared about in that letter he'd never sent to his family. We provided scholarships to students from low-income backgrounds, funded medical research into aneurysms and sudden cardiac events, supported workers who'd been displaced by corporate restructuring, and advocated for labor reform in industries we found were exploiting vulnerable populations. The foundation became my life's work, something that gave meaning and purpose to the inheritance I'd never expected to receive. Journalists wanted to know why I was giving away so much money, why I wasn't using it to buy yachts and private islands. The answer was simple: because I'd lived on the other side of wealth and I understood what it felt like to not have enough, because James had asked me to in that letter, because using money purely for personal indulgence felt hollow and wrong. In the years that followed the lawsuit, I watched what happened to James's family, and it was a lesson in consequences so perfectly orchestrated it felt like the universe itself was teaching them a lesson. Eleanor, stripped of much of her social standing, became increasingly isolated. She developed health problems that money couldn't fix, spending her last years in a suite of doctors' offices and private medical facilities, surrounded by wealth but bereft of the companionship that had once defined her position. She died 5 years after the lawsuit, and only a handful of people attended her funeral. The social legacy she'd spent a lifetime building crumbled faster than it had taken to construct it. Charles's wife left him, taking half their assets and their children, citing his participation in the fraud against me as irreconcilable with the values she'd thought they shared. He descended into substance abuse and legal troubles, eventually losing most of what money remained to him through a series of poor decisions. Richard became obsessed with trying to rebuild the family's reputation, hearing publicists and crisis management teams, only to discover that money couldn't buy back trust or respect once it had been lost. He lived comfortably but miserably, watching the world change around him in ways he couldn't control or manipulate. I didn't celebrate their downfall, but I'd be dishonest if I said I didn't feel something like satisfaction watching people face the consequences of their choices. More importantly, their fall from grace sent a message to others who might be tempted to engage in similar fraud. The case became a precedent, cited in other lawsuits where wealthy families had tried to manipulate inheritances or deliberately withhold information from beneficiaries. In a very real way, my victory wasn't just mine. It belonged to everyone who'd been victimized by the kind of systemic corruption that wealth breeds when it's unchecked. With the foundation established and my life stabilized, I began the work of actually living, something I hadn't really done since James died. I traveled not to exotic resorts but to places where the foundation was working, where I could see firsthand how our money was making a difference. I went to inner-city schools where our scholarship program was sending students to college. I visited research facilities where scientists were working on treatments for the kind of sudden cardiac event that had taken James from me. I met people whose lives had been improved by our interventions, and in doing so, I found a sense of purpose that had been missing during all those years of grief and isolation. I also allowed myself to open up to the possibility of love again. It took years and a lot of therapy, but eventually I started dating. I met a man named Michael, a doctor who worked with underserved populations and had no idea who I was when we first met. He didn't know about my wealth, didn't know about the lawsuit, didn't know anything about the world I'd come from or the battles I'd fought. To him, I was just a woman he met at a charity event, someone who was passionate about helping others, someone whose eyes lit up when she talked about her work. When I finally told him everything, he listened with the same compassionate attention he gave to his patients. He didn't treat me like I was fragile or broken. He treated me like I was someone who'd survived something difficult and come out stronger. We got married in a small ceremony with just family and close friends. My mother cried tears of joy, my sister stood as my maid of honor, and my father, who'd always been skeptical of my marriage to James, gave me away with his arm linked through mine. Michael understood from the beginning that my first love was now my work, that the foundation would always be central to my life, and he supported that completely. He joined me in that work, bringing his medical expertise to bear on the causes we cared about. We didn't have the kind of dramatic love story that books are written about, but we had something better. We had partnership, mutual respect, genuine care, and a shared belief that our lives should mean something beyond ourselves. Now at 41, I look back on the journey with a clarity that I couldn't have had while I was living through it. The years in that studio apartment, as painful as they were, taught me something invaluable. They taught me what it meant to have nothing, what it meant to feel invisible and unvalued, what it meant to exist on the margins of a society that had deemed me unworthy. I wouldn't want to go back to that place for anything, but I'm grateful for what I learned there. That knowledge, that empathy, that understanding of struggle informs everything I do now. When I make decisions about where the foundation's money goes, I'm not thinking from the perspective of someone who's always had wealth. I'm thinking from the perspective of someone who sat alone in a studio apartment, wondering if she'd survive the night. The house I live in now is beautiful, but it's not ostentatious. It's comfortable and warm, filled with art that I love and spaces where I can think and reflect. The money is there, quietly working in the background, growing through investments and dividends, but I've learned that having money isn't about accumulation. It's about possibilities. It's about being able to say yes to opportunities that align with my values. It's about not having to compromise myself or my principles for financial security. It's about being able to help when I see someone in need without calculating whether I can afford it. The $2 million that James left me in that first will, the money I once thought was my entire inheritance, has been donated entirely to the foundation. I didn't need it, and keeping it felt like holding onto the old story, the story where I was dismissed and devalued. Letting it go was a way of releasing that narrative and claiming a new one. Last year, on the 10th anniversary of receiving James's letter, I received something unexpected. It was a letter from Aliner's estate lawyer, sent after Aliner's death. Inside was a handwritten note from Aliner herself, dated shortly before she died. Victoria, it began, and I was shocked to see my name in her handwriting, shocked that she'd thought of me at all. I know I've said nothing and done nothing to make amends for how I treated you. I know that my silence has been interpreted rightly as indifference or cruelty. The truth is more complicated, though I'm not sure that makes any difference to you now. I was afraid of you, though I didn't realize it at the time. I was afraid that James loved you in a way he'd never loved any member of his own family. I was afraid that your presence in his life meant less importance for the rest of us. I was afraid of change, of losing control, of a world that didn't revolve around Ashford family interests and expectations. Those fears made me cruel, and cruelty, I've learned too late, has a way of coming back on you. I've watched what happened to my sons, watched the dissolution of everything I tried so carefully to protect, and I've understood that my attempts to control everything led to the loss of everything. I don't ask for forgiveness because I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know that I see now what I couldn't see then. You were never the problem, I was. Goodbye, Aliner. I read that letter many times, and each time I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of acceptance. Aliner had been trapped by her own fears and limitations, just as James had been trapped by his family dynamics. They were all in their own ways victims of a system that valued control and wealth over connection and love. I was the one who'd managed to break free from that system, not because I was stronger or smarter, but because I'd been forced out of it. I'd been pushed down so hard that I'd had nowhere to go but up. I'd been stripped of everything until the only thing left was my own integrity and my own capacity to love. And that, it turned out, was the most valuable inheritance anyone could possibly leave me. The media still follows my story, though it's less dramatic now than it was in the height of the lawsuit. I give interviews occasionally, speak at conferences about wealth inequality and the responsibility that comes with financial privilege, advocate for laws that protect beneficiaries from the kind of fraud the Ashford family committed. I've become, somewhat to my surprise, a public figure and an advocate. People reach out to me with their own stories of family betrayal and financial injustice, and I listen and try to help where I can. I've started a legal fund specifically to support people who can't afford lawyers in cases of inheritance fraud. I've testified before legislative committees about the need for stronger protections for widows and beneficiaries. I've turned my personal tragedy into a platform for broader change, which I think James would have approved of. On good days, I can feel James's presence in the work I do, in the lives that are changed by the foundation, in the scholarships that send students to college and the research that advances medicine. On harder days, I remember him as I knew him when he was alive, a good man trapped in a difficult situation, trying to do the right thing the only way he knew how. I've forgiven him for his cowardice while he lived, understanding now that he was doing his best with the limited tools he had. His death was tragic and unfair, but the letter he left me transformed that tragedy into something meaningful. He gave me the chance to build a life that actually reflected my values, to use my resources in ways that honored his memory, to become the person I was always meant to be. I still have pancake breakfasts every Sunday with my mother and sister. We maintain that ritual because rituals matter, because they connect us to the people we love and the versions of ourselves we want to be. We sit around my kitchen table and I make too much food the way I always do, and we talk about our lives, our dreams, our struggles. My mother still can't quite believe the number in my bank account, but she's proud of what I'm doing with it. My sister brings her children, and I watch them grow up knowing that their lives are secure because of decisions I made with the money I received. My niece recently told me she wants to be a lawyer so she can help people like me, which made me cry more than I'd like to admit. At 41, sitting in my penthouse overlooking the skyline, I understand now what the real inheritance was. It wasn't the money, though that's certainly part of it. The real inheritance was the knowledge that I could survive anything, that I had the capacity to bounce back from devastation, that I could build a meaningful life even after the world had told me I was worthless. The real inheritance was learning to love myself enough to demand better treatment from others and enough to use my resources generously. The real inheritance was James's final gift to me, that letter that forced me to believe in my own value and to recognize that my life mattered. That inheritance, unlike money, is something that can never be taken away. It's protected by nothing but my own commitment to living in alignment with the values it taught me. This is my story. This is the story of a woman who was pushed out and told she had nothing, who discovered she had everything all along, and who learned that justice delayed is not justice denied if you have the courage to pursue it. It's the story of how grief can be transformed into purpose, how betrayal can lead to clarity, and how love, even after death, can guide us toward the people we're meant to become. It's a story about wealth and loss, about family and rejection, about the thin line between the life we're given and the life we're able to create. Most importantly, it's a story about choosing to be better than the circumstances that tried to define me, about refusing to let other people's limitations become my own, and about building a legacy that honors both the person I was and the person I've become. Before you go, please don't forget to subscribe to this channel, like this video, and share it with your loved ones. I post videos every single day on this channel, so it's a good thing if you check out other videos here too. Don't forget to comment your thoughts and opinions on this story. I'll see you in the next story. Bye.